In 1935, a letter arrived at every foreign embassy on Earth. It was brief, formal, and almost unremarkable in appearance. But the instruction it contained would quietly erase a name that had existed in the mouths of diplomats, poets, conquerors, and cartographers for over 2,000 years. From this point forward, the country you have always called Persia no longer exists, not because it collapsed, not because it was conquered, but because it chose to disappear, on its own terms, in its own language, by its own hand. The question no one has properly answered is why. To understand that question, you have to begin not in 1935, but somewhere far older, somewhere the maps don't fully capture and the textbooks rarely stay long enough to explain. Around 1500 BCE, nomadic peoples moving across the vast corridors of Central Asia began to settle on a high plateau surrounded by mountain ranges and salt deserts. They brought with them languages that shared deep roots with what would eventually become Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. These were not Arab peoples. They were not Semitic in origin. Their word for father, Pitar, echoed in the Latin pater. Their word for fire was atar, the same fire that would later burn at the center of their most sacred temples. They called themselves Aryans, and the land they occupied they called Ariana, the land of the noble ones. History, however, would not call it that for long. Of the groups that settled this plateau, two rose above the others. The Medes established their power in the northwest, building the first major empire of the region. To their south, in a province along the warm coast, lived a people called the Parsua, the Persians. They were not yet powerful, they were not yet imperial, but they were organized around a particular kind of ambition, quiet, patient, and ultimately unstoppable. In the 6th century BCE, a man named Cyrus changed everything. What Cyrus understood that most conquerors before him did not was that the hardest territory to hold is not land, it is loyalty. When Cyrus defeated the Median king and absorbed his empire, he did not replace the Median nobility with Persian lords, he kept them. When he entered Babylon, one of the great cities of the ancient world, he presented himself not as an invader, but as a restorer, the chosen instrument of the Babylonian god Marduk himself. He freed the Jewish exiles who had been held in captivity for generations. He returned sacred objects to the temples his predecessors had plundered. This was not generosity in the conventional sense. It was political architecture of the highest order. The Achaemenid Empire that Cyrus founded and Darius the Great later systematized stretched from the Indus River in the east to the Aegean Sea in the west. It encompassed dozens of languages, hundreds of cultures, and millions of people who had never shared a king before. What held them together was not terror, though terror existed, but a sophisticated administrative network, a royal road stretching over 1,500 miles, a relay messengers who could carry a dispatch from Sardis to Susa in days, and a deliberate policy of allowing the conquered to remain in most ways themselves. Historians sometimes call this the world's first truly multicultural empire. What they mean is that it was the first to govern difference rather than erase it. But there is a paradox buried inside this success. The very name the world attached to this empire, Persia, came not from the Persians themselves, but from the Greeks who feared them. To the Greeks, Persis was a distant alien realm. It was the enemy they defined themselves against. The Persians had a different word for what they were building. They called it an empire of the Aryans. They called their homeland Iran. That discrepancy between the name given by enemies and the name carried inside would haunt this civilization for the next 2.5 millennia. In 334 BCE, a 22-year-old Macedonian king crossed into Persian territory with an army that, by imperial standards, was not especially large. What Alexander lacked in numbers, he replaced with speed, discipline, and an unnerving talent for forcing decisive engagements at exactly the right moment. Within 6 years, the Achaemenid Empire, which had stood for 2 centuries, was gone. What happened next is one of the most misread episodes in ancient history. Alexander did not destroy Persia. He tried to become it. He wore Persian robes at court. He adopted the ritual of proskynesis, the Persian custom of prostration before the king, and demanded his Macedonian generals perform it too. He married Roxana of Bactria and later married Statera, daughter of the Persian king Darius III. He promoted Persian nobles to positions of authority alongside Greeks. He spoke of fusing the two peoples into a single civilization. His Greek generals were furious. Some conspired against him. To them, he had come east to avenge the Persian invasions of Greece, not to become Persian himself. But Alexander had grasped something his generals could not see. You cannot govern a civilization of that depth from the outside. Its culture, its bureaucracy, its spiritual legitimacy, these did not dissolve when Darius fell. They simply waited for someone worthy to inherit them. When Alexander died in 323 BCE without a named heir, his empire fractured, but the Persian plateau remained. New dynasties rose, the Seleucids, then the Parthians, then the Sassanids, each one claiming in different ways to be the continuation of what Cyrus had built. The Sassanid kings called themselves Shahanshah, King of Kings, the same title Darius had used. They restored Zoroastrianism as the state religion. They built fire temples across the plateau. They declared in stone and ceremony that Persia had never truly ended. And then, in the 7th century CE, everything changed again. The Arab armies that swept out of the Arabian Peninsula in the decades following the Prophet Muhammad's death were not simply a military force. They carried with them a complete civilizational vision, a new law, a new language, a new cosmology. Within a generation, the Sassanid Empire was defeated. Within a century, Arabic had replaced Persian as the language of administration and religion across the region. On the surface, this looked like erasure. It was not. What actually happened is one of the more remarkable cultural negotiations in world history. The Persians did not simply absorb Islam, they shaped it. Persian scholars became the great translators and transmitters of Greek philosophy into the Islamic world. Persian poets, Rumi, Hafez, Ferdowsi, wrote in a language that survived conquest by embedding itself inside it. The Persian language re-emerged in the 9th and 10th centuries, now written in Arabic script, carrying Arabic loanwords, but unmistakably Persian in its grammar, its imagery, and its soul. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, completed around 1010 CE, was an act of civilizational defiance disguised as literature. It told the entire mythological and legendary history of the Persian people in verse, and it did so using, according to tradition, an almost entirely Persian vocabulary. In an era dominated by Arabic, this was a declaration: we are still here. We remember who we are. This tension between Persian identity and the larger Islamic world would crystallize centuries later in an act of profound political engineering. In 1501, a young ruler named Ismail seized power in northwestern Iran and founded the Safavid dynasty. Within a decade, he had unified the Persian plateau under his rule and made a decision that would permanently divide the Islamic world. He declared Twelver Shi'a Islam as the official state religion of his empire. At the time, nearly all Muslims in the region were Sunni. Ismail enforced the conversion with considerable coercion. Religious scholars who resisted or killed or exiled. Shia clerics from Iraq and Lebanon were brought in to replace them. The transformation was not gentle. But the effect was lasting and, in retrospect, strategic. By distinguishing itself religiously from the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Mughal Empire to the east, the Safavid state created an Iranian identity that was simultaneously Islamic and distinct from Arabism. Shia Islam became, over generations, not simply a religion, but a marker of civilizational difference, a way of saying, we share a faith with the Arab world, but we are not the Arab world. This is the foundation upon which modern Iran stands. Not the Achaemenid Empire, not the Sassanids, the Safavids. Which brings us back to that letter. When Reza Shah Pahlavi requested in 1935 that foreign governments adopt the name Iran, he was not inventing something new. He was insisting that the world finally use the name Iranians had always used for themselves. Iran, from Aryana, was the indigenous designation. Persia was a Greek imposition, filtered through centuries of European Orientalism that had attached itself to the country like a label placed from the outside. But the Shah's motivations were not purely linguistic. He was a modernizer who had studied how European nations performed their identities internationally. He admired Ataturk's reconstruction of Turkey. He was aware that the word Persia carried, in Western imagination, a specific set of associations: luxury, mysticism, otherness, empire, that he did not want to govern. He wanted Iran to be perceived as a modern nation-state, not a relic of antiquity dressed in silk carpets and poetry. What he did not fully anticipate was the rupture this would cause at home. For many Iranians, particularly intellectuals and the educated class, Persia was not a foreign imposition. It was glory. It was Cyrus and Darius and the first superpower in human history. Abandoning it felt less like reclaiming an authentic name and more like severing a bloodline, erasing a legacy to satisfy the preferences of a modernizing monarch who wanted his country to look a certain way to European diplomats. The name change held, but the argument it contained has never fully been resolved. Today, the two names continue to carry entirely different emotional weights. Iran evokes, for much of the Western world, geopolitical tension, sanctions, religious governance, and decades of fractured relations. Persia evokes something else entirely: ancient grandeur, poetic refinement, the civilizational romance of a world that no longer exists. The same country, two reputations, one living in the present, one preserved in amber. But here is what that split actually reveals. Every civilization that has lasted long enough accumulates multiple selves: the self it was at its founding, the self it became under pressure, the self it performed for its enemies, and the self it held privately, in its own language, in its own prayers, in the names it gave its children. Persia became Iran not because of a letter sent to embassies. It became Iran because it had always been Iran to the people who lived there, spoke there, and buried their dead there across 3,000 years of unbroken memory. The name the world uses for a place is never neutral. It is always, in some measure, a political act, a choice about whose perspective gets to define reality. What Cyrus built, Alexander tried to inherit, and the Safavids reforged was not simply an empire. It was the insistence of a civilization that it has the right to name itself. That insistence has not disappeared. It simply changed its name.